Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room. I hope that you're doing well, guys. In this video, I'm going to respond to a post by a viewer. I was going to say follower, but I can't take that for granted. Maybe they're not a follower yet. Maybe they will never be. But regardless, her name is Alison, and she asked an interesting question about. In regard to my video, on post-existentialism, if you remember that video, and the interesting question that she asked, there was a number of elements to the question, but had to do with just how different is it from existentialism, pure and simple. Of course, there's no real existentialism pure and simple, but usually what people think or mean when they refer to existentialism in its official form is the existentialism of the French, mid-century, or maybe a little before mid-century French philosophy, most notably embodied, in literature by the works of Camus and Sartre, and then in philosophy by Sartre and Camus and Beauvoir to an extent, but her work is a bit different and I won't be getting into it in this video. So now I'm going to try to make this video not overly technical, but I cannot guarantee that at some points I won't get into slightly technical territory, but I'll try to keep it as limited as possible, essentially. So, very good question. Open-groundedness in open monism, in what I kind of somewhat pompously called post-existentialism. How is it different from the Sartrean freedom, the for itself? How is it different from Sartrean-led existentialism in general? What faults does it find with it specifically, and how does it propose to fix them while keeping what's best in existentialism? Because if I decided to dub open monism post-existentialists, this is definitely a way of acknowledging that there's a lot in existentialism that is good, just in the same way that a post-structuralist would think that there's a lot in structuralism that is good, or a post-Kantian would think, etc., etc. In some sense, I see post-existentialism as a rehabilitation of existentialism, because if you think about it, existentialism these days, like 80 or 90 years after it was dominant in continental Europe, or yeah, you could say dominant, it's not such a reputable philosophy. It's influential in other fields than philosophy. It's very influential even to this day on how people conceive of their freedom. I would argue that there is a link between Sartrean existentialism and something as controversial but nevertheless as significant culturally as identity politics. I am free to choose who I am, basically. There's a link there for sure, and that is linked to the idea of I can define my own essence, and the reason why I can define my own essence is because I have freedom over my essence. How do I have freedom over my essence? Well, my existence precedes essence, and my existence is activated, or it plays out always in performance, in action, in doing things in the world. So there's a lot of good things about it, and I think that in some way postmodernism went too far with the idea of like there's nothing to say about essence or about substance, about grounding metaphysical principles, questioning everything, becoming ironic about everything. existentialism is really cool because in a way it offers a certain kind of freedom from the fetters of the Kantian philosophy, although I think Sartre is still very influenced by Kant, whilst maintaining the possibility of an optimistic stance toward the future, you know. And the thing is, even from a pragmatic point of view, this optimistic stance toward the future, I think, is absolutely necessary. So a deeply pessimistic philosophy on this ground alone, I would look at with suspicion. And a deeply ironic philosophy or a deeply deconstructive philosophy, I would also look at with suspicion on pragmatic grounds as well as on more philosophical grounds. You know, I think that there's a lot of issues with postmodernism, more issues than there are with existentialism, but that's not to say that postmodernism didn't bring, you know, interesting innovations in the history of 20th century philosophy. So, in some sense, there's no denying that post-existentialism is a kind of offspring or heir to all these different traditions: existentialism, postmodernism, maybe some post-structuralism as well. But I would be more comfortable with the broad notion of postmodernism, as well as, you know, slightly older philosophies, or very much older philosophies, around monism. You know, post-existentialism is very influenced by the work of an ancient philosopher called Heraclitus, so that's important to keep in mind. It's influenced by Hegel in some ways, and it's influenced by a lot of, and that's on the other side of the divide between the continental and the analytic philosophy, which is becoming less and less divided, I suppose, and hopefully open monism will contribute to that. But it's also very, very influenced by the more analytic kind of philosophy, especially in its more recent iterations of that philosophy and of open monism. You know, I think when I began it was mostly continental with a little bit of Wittgenstein in their language games, you know, notions of language and proposition analysis. But as I've progressed, you know, I think that I've kind of reached a middle point between how continental it is and how analytic it is, and that's kind of also a bit of a dream I have. You know, it's not just the idea of like developing a system, a metaphysical view of the world, which would grant the possibility of a universal ethics, because that's one of the big challenges that I want to resolve. You know, one of the main motivations, a universal ethics, a new universal ethics, which would be very different from the existentialist view. And on top of that, maybe a kind of synthesis or a reconciliation of the insights and main tenets of analytic philosophy, continental philosophy, and pragmatic philosophy as well. In this sense, I feel a strong sense of kinship to Richard Rorty, if you're familiar with this philosopher, in the sense that he doesn't really have any sense of belonging to a particular school. He admits that he's trained in analytic philosophy because that's just where he was born. He was a product of contingency, but he really branched out as he progressed in his philosophical career toward exploring the works of Heidegger, of Nietzsche, of, you know, Wittgenstein, of John Dewey, the pragmatists, and his philosophy. It's very different from mine because his philosophy, I think, is mostly deconstructive in a very different sense from the way in which Derrida's philosophy is deconstructive. But it means to dissolve a lot of what he considers to be pseudo problems, whereas open monism considers that some problems might be pseudo problems and ought to be dissolved, but also proposes to take other traditional problems very seriously and definitely constructs a lot of theoretical edifices to address those problems. So in this sense, it's a much more, you know, naively constructivist philosophy than Rorty's. I suppose you could put it that way. So I've been rambling a lot. Hopefully this context has been useful. So in the second section of this video, I will probably look more specifically at existentialism among all the different philosophical currents that post-existentialism or open monism draws from. It draws from them without associating with any of them specifically. Why does it do that? Well, precisely because it does not think that any of the previous theories or paradigms, if you want to call them that, are perfect or even half right. That's not to say that it considers that any of them is worthless, definitely not. It does consider that there's something to be gained from most of the movements of the last 2 centuries, and before that as well, and tries to, combine everything that's good about everything into something a bit more unified. Maybe the most important place in this framework is occupied by the inheritance of existentialist philosophy, which is why I like the name post-existentialism, and why I will now talk a little bit more about what is the problem with existentialism specifically, and how open monism proposes to maybe not solve them, because I wouldn't have this pretension, especially prior to having finished the work, but address them. Indeed. So, what's excellent about existentialism is this idea that existence is ontologically extremely important. Now, it cannot be exaggerated just how revolutionary that notion was. Before existentialism, existence was not even, it wasn't even an ontological category at all. Existence was, you could possibly say that it wasn't ontologically important in the medieval times, but certainly for the few centuries that preceded existentialism, existence tended to be a variable. It tended to just be seen as a variable. You have a thing, you have an object, let's say. Does it exist or does it not exist? It was really just a way of saying, well, if it exists, it's in the world. It's a member of a set. If it doesn't exist, it's not a member of a set. It's not in the world. So you could take any theoretical object and you could, test it for, or you can just mark it according to whether it's in the world or it's not in the world. If it's in the world, it belongs to the peculiar ontology of the world. If it doesn't, well, then it doesn't exist. But it's kind of a dichotomous variable, and it certainly doesn't take existence itself as qualitatively significant and philosophically interesting. The big revolution that existentialism brought about, and Sartre wasn't the first to bring that into relief. I think that Heidegger did the most to do that, but he also was building on the insights of Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche especially. Is to say, no, existence is not just a variable. Existence is the most fundamental metaphysical thing there is, and in a sense, that's all there is. There's philosophically, metaphysically, ontologically, everything begins with existence. Everything follows from existence. Existence precedes essence in the Sartrean formulation. When you think of Heidegger, he says there are not subjects or objects, there are Dasein. So there are being there, and literally what does being there mean, except there is such a thing. There is a thing that exists and it's there, so it's a grounded thing. So existence is always grounded. And so when existence is infused with metaphysical meaning, I think that it liberates a whole new way of doing philosophy, and Sartrean existentialism develops that by arguing, among other things, that with the positing of metaphysical priority of existence over essence, then you can have freedom. Of course, as long as you have essence first, you can't have freedom. You can try to have freedom, but you're always going to encounter very difficult issues about the consistency and coherence of the concept of free will. it's very, very difficult to reconcile free will with essence. Whereas if you posit existence as the prior metaphysical concept, then in a sense you don't really need free will anymore. You can just reformulate it as an expression of the, of the for itself in Sartre's philosophy. You could formulate it in a number of different ways. Radical freedom, just how the existence being defines itself over time by, according to the existentialist view, have their facticity, evolve through time according to what they do. And their facticity, if you take it somewhat simplistically as the totality of objective facts that constitutes a person, if we are to look specifically at human beings, well, according to what we do, everything we do every day adds a new fact. It adds something new. It modifies our facticity slightly. And so existence is this constantly changing thing which essence does not facilitate. Essence is a rigid thing. And so that's great, and I agree with it, and I think it makes a lot of philosophical sense, and it allows philosophy to move within a realm of intelligibility as something practical, as something that can be practically applied in the world. And existentialism was practically applied in the world, still is. So that's the interesting philosophy, I think, the philosophy that can have a practical impact, not just the work of the armchair guy with a great mind or woman with a great mind. But one of the issues I have with Sartre, as you might have guessed, is that, well, he still considers that essence is a thing. He still says that existence precedes essence, and therefore, in a way, there's two realms going on. There is existence, and then there is essence. So that creates a metaphysical dualism to begin with, and that creates the necessity for transcendence. I think that you could take the transcendence of the ego of the subject in Sartrean existentialism as, first of all, inherited from Kant, but also as Sartre's way of saying, now, there is radical freedom. That's that's something to do with existence. But there is still something essential about the human constitution and about the constitution of being. In the life of a human being, what defines the life and the identity of the person, and in a sense, what defines their unique personhood is existence, first of all. But existence cannot really work without essence, because for Sartre, consciousness is very important, obviously. Now, consciousness itself is not existence. You cannot define consciousness in existential terms, because it seems to be something transcendental. It seems to be something that every human being has access to. So what they do with their actions, sure, defines what they are. But there is, in this process of doing, a transcendental relationship with the consciousness, which is a kind of guide, despite what Sartre might want to think. It's a kind of guide that helps us navigate the world and perform the actions. There's freedom in the actions, but still with this accompanying agency of consciousness. Now, consciousness, maybe we could just say reductively that it is synonymous with the ego or the subject for now, but it is not existence. It's a transcendental entity. And, as the work of, as Sartre's book, Transcendence of the Ego, acknowledges. So there's a dualism between existence and essence. And when Sartre says it precedes essence, in a sense, he's only saying that it precedes essence in the definition of what a human being is. Metaphysically, it turns out that it's somewhat artificial to say that in existentialism, existence precedes essence, because both are metaphysically there. They're both metaphysically impossible to get rid of. So the priority is relative, okay? And I think that's an issue, because I think that you have to get rid of essence completely. And the reason why I think you have to get rid of essence completely is that, well, there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the main issues with it is that transcendence and essence are hopelessly obscure ideas, obscure concepts. And I don't exactly see how they make a lot of sense. And a lot of my philosophical work is to try to, within a Wittgensteinian therapeutic, dissolving problems approach, I try to show that essence and the essential, understanding of consciousness have to be disposed of. There's no reason to posit this extra metaphysical realm and imagine that human beings are constituted by their existence and structured by an essential consciousness, an essentially structured consciousness. Because not only is it very artificial metaphysically and conceptually, it reifies something. There's a reification process going on. It posits that in order to perform all of its explanations of human actions in the world, there needs to be something like consciousness, and it has to be transcendental. It needs to transcend different human beings. Therefore, it has to be abstract. Therefore, it has to be somehow essential, in essence. That's only something that has to be posited because it facilitates Sartre's arguments. But if you can do without it, well, then you don't have the ontological cost of adding this thing, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But of course, and I will tackle this in another video at some point, because I think we can consider that this particular video is only the first chapter, maybe of a series of videos about this topic, because I find it quite interesting, and I think that maybe some of you viewers will find it interesting as well. I will, in the next video, I will discuss at a bit more length how this extra type of entity, metaphysical entity called essence, that gives its form to consciousness, etc., etc. The positing of it becomes actually practically dangerous when you try to apply it in the real world, because that's what allows existentialists, I think, to, and I will explain this in the next video, to exaggerate just how free we are. And if you get rid of this notion of essence, you render the concept of freedom less artificial by also, in a certain sense, reining it in and allowing much more importance to the past and tradition within a fluid rather than rigid perspective. And I think that both in terms of the philosophical soundness that a philosopher should pursue, and in terms of the practical, reality, and in terms of normatively what we would want to do in our lives, it will be clear, hopefully, by the end of my expose, why, if you get rid of essence and you opt for open-groundedness, and I'll show how that is possible, you can arrive at something that's philosophically more solid and practically more wise. All right, but that's all for now. I hope that was interesting, and stay tuned, because I might as well, it's quite possible that I'll record another video tomorrow on Sunday to continue discussing this. All right, ciao.